This is HOA consequences. The HOA made it personal, and I made it documented. Your file is getting thicker today. Nancy Clark shoved a clipboard at my chest, and I stumbled back against my car door. The paper was a witness signature page with 6 names scrawled in blue ink, and she was pointing at each one like she was reading a verdict. I am a car rental lot manager in Louisville, Kentucky, and I work nights. I cannot afford missed shifts. I moved into the Preserve at Oak Grove Design Review Association 6 weeks ago because the rent was reasonable and the location was close to the airport lots. I did not know the HOA micromanaged decals and guest passes like it was fine art. Nancy stepped closer and I could see the veins in her neck. She was wearing a purple light jacket with the hood up and a bright phone case clipped to her belt like a badge. Her red hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, and her face was flushed. She jabbed her finger at the signature page again. Your neighbors voted to tow you. This is official. The board approved it last night. I looked at the list. I recognized 2 of the names as people who lived 3 streets over. I had never spoken to them. I said, voted to tow me for what? She smiled, and it was not friendly. Commercial vehicle parked overnight without a permit. Your contractor left his truck in your driveway for 2 hours yesterday, and we have photographic evidence. That is a violation of Section 12-4-C. I said, he had my permission. He was fixing my water heater. He was here for 2 hours, and he left before dinner. Nancy pulled out her phone and swiped through photos. She held it up and I could see a shot of the truck taken from the sidewalk. She said, 2 hours is the limit for service vehicles. He stayed 2 hours and 7 minutes. That is a violation. I timed it. I stared at her. You timed it? She nodded. I sit on the Gate Access Committee. It is my job to monitor compliance. The rules are clear. Commercial vehicles without advance written approval are subject to immediate tow. I said, I did not get a notice. I did not get a warning. You are talking about towing my car right now because a guy fixed my water heater? Nancy leaned in and her voice dropped. I will make an example out of you so everyone learns. This neighborhood has standards. If we let one person slide, the whole community falls apart. I felt my stomach tighten. I said, what does that mean? You are going to tow my car? She held up the clipboard again. We already called the vendor. The truck is on its way. You have 10 minutes to move your vehicle off HOA property, or we will immobilize it with a tire clamp and tow it at your expense. I said, this is insane. My car is parked in my own driveway. How is that HOA property? Nancy crossed her arms. Your driveway is part of the common area plat. Read your covenant. Everything from the curb to your front door is maintained by the association. That means we control what parks there. I said, I have lived here 6 weeks. I have never seen this rule enforced. She said, that is because I just took over enforcement last month. The previous administrator was too soft. I am cleaning up the mess. I pulled out my phone and opened the covenant PDF I had saved when I signed the lease. I scrolled through the parking section and found Section 12-4-C. I read it out loud. Commercial vehicles may not park overnight in common areas without advance written approval from the Design Review Board. Overnight means between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. Nancy blinked. I said, it is 3 p.m. right now. The truck left at 6 p.m. yesterday. That is not overnight. That is daytime service. She snatched the phone out of my hand and read the section herself. Her face went red. She handed the phone back and said, The board interprets overnight broadly. Any extended parking period is considered overnight for enforcement purposes. I said, that is not what the rule says. She said, the board has discretion. If you want to appeal, you can submit a written request to the Design Review Committee. The next meeting is in 3 weeks. I said, 3 weeks? You are towing my car today. She smiled again. Exactly. That is why you should have followed the rules in the first place. I will bury you in notices until you run out of printer ink. A tow truck turned the corner and rolled up the street. It was a white flatbed with amber lights flashing on the roof. The driver leaned out the window and waved at Nancy. She waved back and pointed at my car. I said, you cannot do this. This is my car. I am not blocking emergency access. I am not violating any rule. Nancy pulled a small black remote control out of her jacket pocket and held it up. It had 3 buttons and a red LED. She said, this is the tire clamp remote. I can activate it from here. Once it locks, the tow driver hooks your car and you pay the release fee at the yard. $400 plus storage. I stared at the remote. I said, you are threatening me with a remote control? She pressed the top button, and I heard a loud click from my front wheel. I looked down and saw a tire clamp snap shut around the rim. The metal arms locked into place, and a yellow warning sticker popped out on a spring-loaded arm. The tow driver climbed out of the cab and walked over. He was a big guy in a stained blue jumpsuit, with a tool bag slung over his shoulder. He looked at the tire clamp and nodded. He said, you got the authorization paperwork? Nancy handed him a folded sheet of paper. He unfolded it and read it. He looked at me and said, you, the owner? I said, yes. This is my car. I did not violate any rule. She is making this up. The driver shrugged. He said, I just need the authorization. If the HOA says tow, I tow. You got a problem, you take it up with them. Nancy said, he has no grounds to dispute. The board voted. The signatures are on file. Hook it up. I said, wait. I want to see the minutes from that board meeting. I want to see the vote. Nancy said, the minutes are not published yet. You can request them in writing after the next meeting. I said, you just told me the board voted last night. If they voted, there are minutes. She said, draft minutes are confidential until approved. I pulled out my phone and started recording. I said, so you are telling me the board voted to tow my car, but I cannot see the vote, and I cannot appeal for 3 weeks, and you are towing me right now based on a rule you are misquoting. Nancy stepped closer and knocked the phone out of my hand. It hit the pavement and skidded under my car. She said, no recording without consent. That is harassment. The tow driver picked up my phone and handed it back to me. He said, lady, I do not care about your HOA drama. I need the authorization, and I need it signed by the board president. Is this signed? Nancy grabbed the paper back and pointed at the bottom. She said, right here. Board president's signature, dated yesterday. The driver squinted at the signature. He said, this says Gate Access Administrator. That is not the board president. Nancy said, I am authorized to sign on behalf of the board for enforcement actions. The driver folded the paper and handed it back. He said, no. I need the president's signature, or I do not hook it. That is company policy. We got sued last year for hooking a car on bad paperwork, and I am not doing it again. Nancy's face went purple. She said, I am telling you, this is authorized. The board gave me discretion. The driver shook his head. He said, "Call your president and get a signature. I will wait 15 minutes. After that, I am gone." Nancy pulled out her phone and walked 10 feet away. I could hear her voice rising as she talked. The driver leaned against the truck and pulled out a pack of gum. He offered me a piece, and I took it. I said, "Thank you." He said, "No problem. I have seen this before. HOAs go crazy with the tow threats, and half the time the paperwork is garbage. I am not risking my license." Nancy came back, and she was breathing hard. She said, "The president is out of town. He will email the authorization in an hour." The driver said, "I will come back when you have it. Unclamp his wheel." Nancy said no. "The clamp stays until he pays the fine." The driver said, "I am not hooking a clamped wheel without signed authorization. Unclamp it, or I leave." Nancy stared at him. Then she pulled out the remote and pressed the bottom button. The clamp released with a loud click, and the arms folded back. She picked it up and walked back to her car without saying another word. The driver climbed back into his truck and drove off. I stood in my driveway and my hands were shaking. I went inside and sat down at my kitchen table. I opened my laptop and pulled up the HOA covenant again. I read section 12-4-C 3 more times. It was clear. Overnight meant 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. The contractor truck had never been there overnight. I opened my email and searched for messages from the HOA management company. I found the welcome email from 6 weeks ago. It had a link to the resident portal. I clicked it and logged in. There was a section for design review requests. I clicked on parking permits. The page said all parking permit requests must be submitted at least 10 business days in advance. I pulled up my calendar. The contractor had come yesterday. That was Tuesday. 10 business days before Tuesday was the previous Monday. I had moved in 6 weeks ago, which was a Thursday. I did not even know about the permit requirement until today. I clicked on the enforcement section of the portal. There was a list of violations for my address. I scrolled down and saw 3 entries. The first was dated 2 days after I moved in. It said failure to display guest parking pass. The second was dated 1 week later. It said unapproved front door wreath. The third was dated yesterday. It said commercial vehicle violation. I clicked on the wreath violation. The note said a seasonal decoration was installed without design review approval. I did not have a wreath. I had a plain brass door knocker that came with the unit. I took screenshots of everything. Then I went outside and walked around the neighborhood. I counted 14 houses with wreaths. I counted 9 houses with contractor trucks parked in driveways. I took photos of all of them. I went back inside and called the HOA management company. The receptionist put me on hold for 8 minutes. Then a woman with a tired voice picked up. She said, "This is Linda. How can I help you?" I said, "I need to talk to someone about an enforcement issue. Nancy Clark is threatening to tow my car for a violation that does not exist." Linda sighed. She said, "Nancy is new. She is very enthusiastic. What is the violation?" I explained the contractor truck situation. I explained the overnight rule. I explained the signature page and the tire clamp and the tow truck driver refusing to hook my car. Linda said, "Okay, let me pull up your account. What is your address?" I gave her my address. She typed for a minute. Then she said, "I see the violations on file. The commercial vehicle entry is dated yesterday at 4 p.m. The notes say the vehicle was parked for 2 hours and 7 minutes in violation of Section 12-4-C. I said, that section only applies to overnight parking. The truck was there during the day. Linda said, let me read the rule. She went quiet. Then she said, you are right. This is not an overnight violation. I will remove it from your file. I said, Nancy also told me the board voted to tow me last night. Can I see the minutes? Linda said, there was no board meeting last night. The last meeting was 2 weeks ago. Nancy does not have the authority to call a vote. I felt my chest loosen. I said, so the signature page is fake? Linda said, I do not know what signature page you are talking about. Nancy is authorized to issue courtesy warnings, but she cannot approve tows without the board president's signature. If she told you there was a vote, that is incorrect. I said, she also clamped my wheel with a remote control. Is that legal? Linda went quiet. Then she said, we do not use remote clamps. We contract with a tow vendor that uses manual clamps, and they are only applied after a 48-hour notice period. If Nancy used a remote clamp, that is not an HOA device. I said, so she brought her own equipment? Linda said, I do not know. I will send an email to the board president and copy you. Can you send me photos of the clamp and the signature page? I said yes, and gave her my email address. She said she would follow up within 24 hours. I hung up and opened my photos. I had taken pictures of the tire clamp and the signature page while Nancy was on the phone with the board president. I sent them to Linda. Then I sat down and thought about what Nancy had said. I will bury you in notices until you run out of printer ink. She had said it with a smile, like it was a promise. I opened the resident portal again and looked at my violation history. 3 violations in 6 weeks. None of them were real. The guest parking pass violation was from a day when I did not have any guests. The wreath violation was for a decoration I did not have. The commercial vehicle violation was based on a misreading of the rule. I clicked on each violation and downloaded the attached photos. The guest parking pass photo showed a car parked on the street in front of my unit. It was not my car. It was a red sedan with an out-of-state plate. The wreath photo showed my front door, but the angle was wrong. The door in the photo had a covered porch. My door did not have a porch. It was the wrong unit. My phone buzzed. It was an email from Linda at the management company. The subject line said, urgent enforcement issue. I opened it. The email said the board president had reviewed my complaint and confirmed that Nancy did not have authorization to issue a tow order. The commercial vehicle violation had been removed from my file. The board president requested that I send any additional documentation of Nancy's actions so they could address the matter at the next board meeting. The email also said the HOA did not own or authorize the use of remote tire clamps. If Nancy had used a personal device to immobilize my vehicle, that was outside the scope of her authority and could be considered vandalism or illegal restraint. I forwarded the email to myself and saved a copy in 3 places. Then I called my car insurance company and asked about coverage for HOA towing disputes. The agent said my policy covered towing if it was the result of an accident or mechanical failure, but not if it was a civil dispute. She suggested I contact a local attorney if the HOA continued to threaten towing. I hung up and searched for HOA attorneys in Louisville. I found a guy named Robert Chen, who specialized in homeowner association disputes. His website said he offered free 15-minute consultations. I called and left a message. Then I went to work. I had a night shift starting at 8 p.m., and I could not afford to miss it. I drove to the car rental lot and clocked in. My manager asked why I looked stressed, and I told him about the HOA situation. He laughed and said he lived in a neighborhood with no HOA, and it was the best decision he ever made. I spent the shift processing returns and cleaning cars. Around midnight, I got a text from an unknown number. It said, "This is Robert Chen. I got your message about the HOA towing threat. I can meet you tomorrow at 2 p.m. if you are available. My office is downtown near the courthouse." I texted back and said yes. Then I finished my shift and drove home. It was 3 a.m. when I pulled into my driveway. The neighborhood was dark and quiet. I got out of my car and locked the door. Then I saw something on my windshield. It was a yellow sticker about the size of a playing card. I peeled it off and held it up to the streetlight. It said "Final Warning" in big letters. And below that it said "Unauthorized Parking. Violation of Section 12-4-C. Vehicle subject to immediate tow." The sticker had no date and no signature. It was printed on cheap paper with a peel and stick backing. I turned it over and saw a note written in blue pen. It said, "Last chance. Move your vehicle by 6 a.m. or we clamp it again." I pulled out my phone and took a photo of the sticker. Then I looked at my doorbell camera app. I scrolled back to see if it had recorded Nancy putting the sticker on my windshield. The camera had motion alerts turned on, so it should have caught her if she was there. I found the alert. It was time-stamped at 2:40 a.m. I played the video. Nancy walked up to my car from the sidewalk. She was wearing the same purple light jacket and carrying a roll of yellow stickers. She peeled one off and slapped it on my windshield. Then she stood there for a few seconds and looked at my front door. She pulled out her phone and took a photo of my car and the sticker together. Then she walked away. I saved the video to my phone and sent it to Linda at the management company. Then I sent it to Robert Chen with a note that said, "She came back at 2 a.m. and put this sticker on my car." The video shows her face clearly. I went inside and set an alarm for 6 a.m. I wanted to be awake in case Nancy came back with the tire clamp. I lay down on the couch and tried to sleep, but my mind was racing. My phone was almost full, and I needed to back up the doorbell camera footage before it got overwritten. I plugged the phone into my laptop and started copying the files. The transfer took 20 minutes. At 6 a.m., I woke up and looked outside. My car was still in the driveway with no tire clamp. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Robert Chen. He said, "That video is gold. See you at 2 p.m. Bring all your documentation." I spent the morning organizing my evidence. I printed out the email from Linda. I printed out the covenant parking section with the overnight definition highlighted. I printed out the doorbell camera screenshots showing Nancy applying the sticker. I printed out the photos of the other contractor trucks parked in the neighborhood. I put everything in a folder. At 1:30 p.m., I drove downtown to Robert Chen's office. It was on the third floor of a building across from the courthouse. The waiting room had 2 chairs and a coffee machine. Robert came out at exactly 2 p.m. He was a short guy in a gray suit with wire-rimmed glasses. He shook my hand and led me into his office. He said, "Tell me everything." I spent 30 minutes walking him through the timeline. I showed him the evidence folder. He took notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said, This is a straightforward abuse of authority case. Nancy is acting outside the scope of her position, and the HOA is liable for her actions. The video of her applying the sticker at 2 a.m. is particularly damaging because it shows premeditation and harassment. I said, "What do I do?" He said, "First, we send a cease and desist letter to the HOA management company and the board president. We cite the unauthorized tow attempt, the fake board vote, the personal tire clamp device, and the 2 a.m. sticker incident. We demand that Nancy be removed from any enforcement role and that all violations on your file be expunged. We also demand a written apology and reimbursement for your attorney consultation fee." I said, "Will that work?" He said, "Maybe. If they ignore it, we file a complaint in small claims court for harassment, defamation, and illegal restraint. We also file a complaint with the Kentucky Real Estate Commission because the management company failed to supervise Nancy. That usually gets their attention." I said, "How much will that cost?" He said, "The cease and desist letter is $200. If we go to court, it is another $500 plus filing fees. But if we win, the HOA pays your legal costs. And based on what you have shown me, we will win." I said, "Do it." He said he would draft the letter and send it that afternoon. He also said I should keep recording any further contact with Nancy and that I should not engage with her directly. If she showed up at my door, I should call the police and report harassment. I drove home and waited. At 5 p.m., I got an email from Robert. The letter had been sent to the management company, the board president, and Nancy directly. It included copies of the doorbell video, the email from Linda, and the fake signature page. At 6 p.m., my phone rang. It was Linda from the management company. She said, "We received the letter from your attorney. I want you to know that we are taking this very seriously. The board president has called an emergency meeting for tomorrow night, and Nancy has been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation." I said, "What does that mean?" She said, "It means Nancy is not allowed to perform any enforcement duties or contact you in any way. If she does, you should call the police immediately. The board will review the evidence and make a decision about her future with the committee." I said, "What about my violation file?" She said, "All 3 violations have been removed. Your record is clear. We are also issuing a formal apology letter that will be mailed to you within 3 business days." I said, "What about the tow vendor? Are they still contracted with the HOA?" Linda paused. She said, "That is part of the investigation. If Nancy used a personal device to clamp your wheel, that is a separate issue. The board will decide whether to continue the relationship with the tow vendor or terminate the contract." I thanked her and hung up. Then I went outside and checked my car. No sticker, no clamp. I went back inside and made dinner. The next night, I drove to the HOA clubhouse for the emergency board meeting. Robert had told me I did not have to attend, but I wanted to see what happened. The meeting started at 7 p.m. The clubhouse was a small building next to the pool with a meeting room and a kitchenette. About 20 residents were there, including Nancy. Nancy was sitting in the back row with her arms crossed. She was wearing the same purple light jacket, and her face was red. The board president, a tall man in his 60s named Greg, stood at the front and called the meeting to order. He said, "We are here to discuss the recent enforcement actions taken by Nancy Clark, the gate access administrator. We have reviewed the evidence submitted by a resident and we have some serious concerns. Greg pulled up a laptop and connected it to a projector. The doorbell video appeared on the wall. He played it without sound. Nancy walked up to my car, slapped the sticker on the windshield, took a photo, and walked away. Greg said, "This video was recorded at 2:40 a.m. on Wednesday." "Nancy, can you explain why you were on this resident's property at that hour?" Nancy stood up. She said, "I was performing my enforcement duties. The resident had an outstanding violation, and I was delivering a final warning." Greg said, "You delivered a warning sticker at 2:40 in the morning?" Nancy said, "The rules do not specify a time limit for enforcement actions. I was within my authority." Greg said, "Your authority as gate access administrator is to monitor gate codes and issue guest passes. You are not authorized to issue violation notices, approve tows, or use personal equipment to immobilize vehicles. That is the job of the management company and the board." Nancy said, "I was given discretion to enforce parking rules. The previous administrator did not do his job, and the neighborhood was falling apart. I was cleaning up the mess." Greg said, "You were not given discretion to fabricate board votes, use fake signature pages, or harass residents at 2 in the morning. The board never voted to tow this resident's car. You lied." Nancy's face went purple. She said, "I did not lie. I interpreted the rule and I enforced it. If the board has a problem with my interpretation, they should clarify the rule." Greg held up a printed copy of the covenant. He said, "The rule is already clear. Overnight parking means 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. The contractor truck was never parked overnight. You issued a violation based on a rule that does not exist." Nancy said, "The board has discretion to interpret the rules broadly. That is in the bylaws." Greg said, "Show me where it says that." Nancy pulled out her phone and scrolled through a document. She said, "Section 4-2-A. The board may interpret covenant provisions in a manner consistent with the intent of the association." Greg said, "That section allows the board to interpret ambiguous language. It does not allow you to invent new rules. And even if it did, you are not the board. You are an administrator. You do not have the authority to interpret anything." Nancy said, "I am protecting the neighborhood. If we let one person violate the rules, everyone will violate the rules. I will make an example out of you so everyone learns." Greg said, "You just said that to me. Did you say that to the resident as well?" Nancy realized her mistake and sat down. Greg clicked to the next slide. It was a photo of the tire clamp remote control. Greg said, "This device was used to immobilize the resident's vehicle without authorization." "Nancy, where did you get this remote?" Nancy said, "It is a vendor tool. The tow company gave it to me so I could mark vehicles for pickup." Greg said, "I called the tow company this morning. They said they never issued a remote clamp device to anyone at the HOA. They said their clamps are manual and require a key." "So where did you get this remote?" Nancy did not answer. Greg said, "I also called the vendor and asked for a copy of the authorization paperwork you submitted. They sent me this." He held up a sheet of paper. It was the same form Nancy had shown the tow driver. But now, I could see the signature clearly. It was signed by Nancy with the title Gate Access Administrator. Greg said, "You forged a tow authorization and submitted it to the vendor. That is fraud." The vendor refused to hook the vehicle because the driver recognized that you are not the board president. If he had hooked it, the HOA would be liable for an illegal tow, and we would be facing a lawsuit. Nancy stood up again. She said, I did what I had to do. The resident was violating the rules, and nobody else was doing anything about it. I took action. Greg said, you took illegal action. You lied about a board vote. You used a fake signature. You harassed a resident at 2 in the morning. You used a personal device to immobilize his vehicle. All of that is outside your authority, and it exposes the HOA to serious liability. Nancy said, fine. If the board does not support enforcement, I quit. Greg said, you do not have to quit. You are fired. Effective immediately, you are removed from the Gate Access Committee and banned from any enforcement role. If you contact this resident again, we will file a restraining order. Nancy grabbed her purse and walked out. The door slammed behind her. The room was silent. Greg turned to the rest of us. He said, I want to apologize to the resident who was targeted by Nancy's actions. This is not how the HOA should operate. We will be reviewing our enforcement procedures and implementing new oversight measures to prevent this from happening again. If anyone else has experienced similar treatment, please contact the management company, and we will investigate. One woman in the front row raised her hand. She said, Nancy gave me a violation notice for parking my car in my own driveway. She said I needed a permit. Another man said, she told me my mailbox color was not approved, and I had to repaint it or face a fine. Greg sighed. He said, if Nancy issued you a violation, send the details to the management company and we will remove it. We are also terminating our contract with the tow vendor she was working with because they did not follow proper authorization procedures. If you are enjoying this HOA chaos, hit like and subscribe for more neighborhood drama and justice stories. I stayed for the rest of the meeting. The board voted to adopt new enforcement guidelines that required all violations to be issued by the management company with board approval. They also voted to require two-factor authorization for any towing action, meaning both the board president and the management company had to sign off. After the meeting, Greg pulled me aside. He said, I am sorry you had to deal with this. Nancy was hired 3 months ago, and we thought she would be an asset to the community. We did not realize she had such an extreme view of enforcement. I said, why did she target me? Greg said, I do not know. Maybe because you were new and she thought you would not fight back. Maybe because she wanted to make an example to scare other residents. Either way, it was wrong, and we are taking steps to make sure it does not happen again. I thanked him and left. When I got home, I checked my mailbox. There was a white envelope with the HOA logo on it. I opened it and found a one-page letter on official letterhead. It said the HOA formally apologized for the unauthorized enforcement actions taken by Nancy Clark. It said all violations on my file had been removed, and that I would not face any further action related to the contractor truck incident. The letter also said the board had voted to reimburse me for my attorney consultation fee and any other costs I incurred as a result of Nancy's actions. I just needed to submit receipts to the management company. I scanned the letter and emailed it to Robert Chen. He replied within an hour and said, good outcome. Keep the letter in case anything else happens. If Nancy contacts you again, call the police immediately. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. 2 days later, I came home from work and found a new sticker on my windshield. It was the same yellow design with the same handwritten note. It said, you think you won, but I am not done with you. I checked my doorbell camera. Nancy had come back at 3 a.m. and applied the sticker. She was wearing a dark hoodie instead of her purple jacket, but I could see her face clearly under the streetlight. I called the police non-emergency line and filed a report. The dispatcher said an officer would come out to take a statement. 20 minutes later, a patrol car pulled up. The officer was a young guy with a crew cut. He looked at the sticker and the doorbell video. He said, "This is harassment. Do you want to press charges?" I said, "Yes." He said, "I will file a report and forward it to the prosecutor. In the meantime, I can issue a criminal trespass warning. If she comes back, she will be arrested." I said, "Do it." The officer wrote up the trespass warning and gave me a copy. He said, "If she shows up again, call 911 immediately. Do not engage with her. Let us handle it." I thanked him and he left. I sent the new video and the police report to Robert, Chen, and Linda at the management company. Linda replied and said the board was meeting again to discuss additional action. The next morning, I got a call from Greg, the board president. He said, "We are pursuing a restraining order against Nancy. The police report gives us the grounds we need. We are also filing a formal complaint with the Kentucky Real Estate Commission because her actions violated professional conduct standards." I said, "What does that mean for me?" He said, "It means you are protected. If Nancy violates the restraining order, she will be arrested. The HOA will cover your legal fees if you decide to sue her personally for harassment or defamation." I said, "I just want this to stop." He said, "It will. We are doing everything we can to make sure Nancy never works in HOA enforcement again." A week later, I received a copy of the restraining order in the mail. Nancy was banned from coming within 500 feet of my home or workplace. She was also banned from contacting me in any way, including through third parties. I thought that was finally the end of it. But then the escalation got worse. One morning, I woke up and found traffic cones placed around my car in a tight pattern. They were the kind construction crews use, bright orange with reflective tape. There were 6 of them, arranged so close together that I could not open my car door without moving them. I checked my doorbell camera. Nancy had come back at 2:30 a.m. She was wearing the same dark hoodie and carrying a mesh bag full of cones. She placed them one by one around my car, then stood back and took a photo. Then she left. I called the police again. This time, a different officer came out, a woman in her 40s. She looked at the cones in the video. She said, "This is a clear violation of the restraining order. I am going to issue a warrant for her arrest." I said, "She keeps coming back. What do I do?" The officer said, "Keep recording. Keep calling us. We will catch her. In the meantime, I suggest you install a motion-activated spotlight on your driveway. Make it bright enough that she cannot hide." I went to the hardware store that afternoon and bought a high-powered LED spotlight with a motion sensor. I installed it on the side of my garage so it covered the entire driveway. That night, I tested it. The light was bright enough to read a book by. The next night, the light triggered at 2:20 a.m. I woke up and checked the doorbell camera live feed. Nancy was walking up my driveway with a roll of yellow stickers in her hand. As soon as she stepped into the light, she froze. She looked up at the camera, then at the spotlight. Then she turned and ran. I called the police. They arrived within 10 minutes and searched the neighborhood, but Nancy was gone. The officer said they would increase patrols in the area and watch for her car. 2 days later, I got a call from the police. They said Nancy had been arrested at her home on an outstanding warrant for violating the restraining order. She was being held on $5,000 bond. I felt a wave of relief. I thought it was finally over. But then I got a call from Robert Chen. He said, "Nancy posted bond. She is out. You need to be careful. If she comes back, she is looking at jail time, so she might escalate." I said, "What do you mean, escalate?" He said, "I have seen cases where people in her position feel like they have nothing to lose. They might try something drastic. Just keep your guard up and keep recording everything." That night, I did not sleep. I kept checking the doorbell camera every 15 minutes. Nothing happened. The next night, the same thing. The spotlight stayed dark. I started to relax. Then, on the third night after Nancy's arrest, I came home from work at 3 a.m. and found my car gone. I stood in my driveway and stared at the empty space where my car should have been. The spotlight was on, and the driveway was lit up like a stage. There were no tire marks, no sign of a struggle. The car was just gone. I checked the doorbell camera. At 1:15 a.m., a tow truck had pulled up. It was not the same white flatbed from before. This one was a red wheel lift with no company markings. A man in a dark jumpsuit climbed out, hooked my car, and lifted the front wheels off the ground. The whole process took less than 3 minutes. Then the truck drove away. I called the police. The dispatcher said an officer would respond, but it might take an hour because they were dealing with a multi-car accident on the interstate. I said it was an emergency, and she said she would prioritize it. I called Robert Chen. He did not answer, so I left a message. Then I called Linda at the management company. She did not answer either. I sent both of them the doorbell video. 40 minutes later, a police car pulled up. It was the same female officer from before. She looked at the video and said, "This is an illegal tow. Did you authorize it?" I said no. I do not know who that company is. I have never seen that truck before. She said, "I will run the plate." She wrote down the truck's license number from the video and called it in. A few minutes later, she got a response. She said, "The truck is registered to a private towing company in Indiana. They do not have a contract with the city or any HOA in this area." I said, "So Nancy hired them?" The officer said, "That is what it looks like. I am going to call the company and find out where your car is." She made the call on her radio. I could hear the dispatcher relay the request. A few minutes later, the response came back. The tow company said the vehicle was at their yard in Jeffersonville, Indiana, just across the river. They said they had been hired by a private individual to remove an abandoned vehicle. The officer said, "Your car is not abandoned. This is an illegal tow, and we are going to get it back. But you need to go to the yard and show them proof of ownership. I will call ahead and tell them to release the vehicle without charging you a fee." I said, "What about Nancy?" The officer said, "This is a new charge. Conspiracy to commit theft and illegal restraint. I am going to issue a second warrant. If she is not already in custody by the time I get back to the station, she will be by tomorrow morning." I thanked her and got into my work vehicle, a rental sedan I kept for backup. I drove across the river to Jeffersonville and found the tow yard. It was a chain-link lot behind a truck repair shop. The gate was locked, and there was a sign that said closed, open at 8 a.m. I called the number on the sign. A man answered and said, "Yeah?" I said, "I am here to pick up my car. The Louisville police called you." He said, "Oh, right. That mess. Yeah. I got the call. I will meet you there in 10 minutes." He hung up. I waited in the parking lot. 10 minutes later, a pickup truck pulled in, and a man in his 50s climbed out. He unlocked the gate and waved me through. He said, "Your car is in the back. Follow me." We walked through rows of wrecked and impounded vehicles. My car was parked near the rear fence, still hooked to the red wheel lift. The man unhooked it and lowered it to the ground. He said, "You are lucky the cop called. We were about to charge you $400 for the tow and storage." I said, "Who hired you to tow it?" He pulled out a clipboard and flipped through some papers. He said, "A woman named Nancy Clark. She called yesterday and said the vehicle was abandoned in her neighborhood and needed to be removed. She paid cash up front." I said she lied. "It is my car and it was parked in my own driveway." He said, "Yeah, I figured that out when the cop called. I told her we do not do private tows without proper authorization, but she said she had paperwork. She never sent it." He handed me a tow release receipt in a plastic sleeve. He said, "Sign this and you can take your car. No charge." I signed it and drove out of the yard. By the time I got back to Louisville, it was 5 a.m. I went home and tried to sleep, but I could not stop thinking about Nancy. She had violated a restraining order, hired a private tow company, and stolen my car. What was she going to do next? At 9 a.m., I got a call from the police. Nancy had been arrested again. This time she was being held without bond because she was a flight risk. The officer said she would face multiple charges, including harassment, stalking, violating a restraining order, conspiracy to commit theft, and illegal restraint. The prosecutor was also considering fraud charges for the fake tow authorization. I said, "What happens now?" The officer said, "She will have a preliminary hearing in a few days. You will need to testify. After that, it goes to trial unless she pleads out. Based on the evidence, I think she will plead." I said, "What about the HOA?" The officer said, "That is a civil matter. You will need to work with your attorney on that." I called Robert Chen. He said, "This is good news. The criminal charges give us leverage. I am going to draft a demand letter to the HOA asking for a full refund of any fees you paid, a written apology, and compensation for your time and emotional distress. If they refuse, we sue." I said, "How much compensation?" He said, "I am thinking $5,000. That is enough to cover your attorney fees, your time off work, and the harassment you endured. It is also enough to make the HOA think twice before hiring someone like Nancy again." I said, "Do it." Robert sent the demand letter that afternoon. 3 days later, Linda from the management company called me. She said, "The board has reviewed your demand and they are willing to settle. They will refund your attorney fees, issue a formal written apology, and pay you $5,000 in compensation. In exchange, you agree not to sue the HOA or speak publicly about this matter." I said, "What about Nancy?" Linda said, "Nancy has been permanently banned from any HOA role or employment in the state of Kentucky. The board has also filed a complaint with the Kentucky Real Estate Commission and the State Attorney General's office. She will never work in property management or HOA enforcement again." I said, "What about the tow vendor?" Linda said, "We terminated the contract. We are now using a different company with stricter authorization procedures. We also implemented a new policy that requires board approval for any towing action, and all approvals must be documented with timestamps and signatures." I said, "I want the settlement in writing." Linda said, "I will email you the agreement this afternoon." I got the email 2 hours later. I read it twice, then forwarded it to Robert. He called me and said, "This is a good deal. Take it." I signed the agreement and sent it back. A week later, I received a check for $5,000 and a 2-page apology letter from the board president. The letter said the HOA took full responsibility for Nancy's actions and apologized for the harassment, the illegal tow, the fake violations, and the emotional distress I had endured. It also said the board had implemented new oversight measures to prevent similar incidents in the future. I cashed the check and put the letter in a folder with all the other evidence. I thought about framing it, but decided that would be too petty. A month later, Nancy pleaded guilty to harassment, stalking, and violating a restraining order. She was sentenced to 6 months in jail, suspended, with 2 years of probation. She was also ordered to pay restitution for the illegal tow and banned from contacting me for the duration of her probation. Robert called me after the hearing and said, "That is as good as it gets. She has a criminal record now, and she will never work in HOA enforcement again. You won." I said, "It does not feel like winning. It feels like I spent 3 months fighting a crazy person over parking rules." He said, "That is what HOA disputes are like. Most of them are not about the rules. They are about power and control. Nancy wanted to make an example out of you, and you refused to be an example. That is why she escalated. That is why she violated the restraining order. She could not accept that someone stood up to her." I said, "So what do I do now?" He said, "Live your life. Keep the documentation in case she tries anything after probation ends. And maybe consider moving to a neighborhood without an HOA." I laughed and said I would think about it. 6 months later, I was still living in the preserve at Oak Grove. The new enforcement procedures were working. The management company issued violations only for clear, documented rule breaches, and every violation included a photo, a rule citation, and a 10-day appeal window. The new tow vendor required written authorization from both the board president and the management company before hooking any vehicle. I had not seen Nancy since her arrest. I heard from a neighbor that she moved out of state after her probation started. I did not ask where she went. I did not care. One afternoon, I was working in my driveway when a gate technician walked up with a tool bag. He said, "I am here to fix the keypad." "You called about it sticking?" I said no. I did not call. He pulled out a work order and showed it to me. It had my address and a note that said resident reported keypad malfunction. The signature at the bottom was Nancy's. I said, "Nancy does not work here anymore. She has not worked here for 6 months." The technician said, "This work order is dated yesterday. It came through the system from the gate access portal." I said, "Let me make a call." I called Linda at the management company. She answered on the second ring. I said, "Did Nancy put in a work order for my unit?" Linda said, "No. Nancy does not have access to the portal anymore. Let me check the system." I heard typing. Then Linda said, "I see the work order. It was submitted from an old login that should have been deactivated. I am canceling it now. Tell the technician to leave." I hung up and told the technician. He shrugged and left. I called Robert Chen and told him what happened. He said, "That is a probation violation. Call the police and report it." I called the police non-emergency line and filed a report. The dispatcher said an officer would follow up. 2 days later, I got a call from the prosecutor's office. They said Nancy had violated her probation by accessing the HOA portal and submitting a fraudulent work order. A warrant had been issued, and she would be brought back for a probation revocation hearing. The hearing was scheduled for the following month. I testified about the work order and the technician showing up at my door. Nancy sat at the defendant's table and did not make eye contact. The judge revoked her probation and sentenced her to serve the original 6-month jail term. Nancy was taken into custody immediately. Robert called me after the hearing. He said, "That is the end of it. She will be in jail for 6 months, and after that, she will be on probation for another 1.5 years. If she contacts you again, she goes back to jail. You are done." I said, "I hope so." He said, "You did everything right. You documented everything. You followed the law. You did not retaliate. That is why you won. Most people in your situation would have done something stupid and ended up in trouble themselves. You stayed calm and let the system work." I thanked him and hung up. That night, I sat in my driveway and looked at the neighborhood. It was quiet. The streetlights were on and the air was cool. I thought about everything that had happened. The tire clamp, the fake board vote, the 2 a.m. sticker, the traffic cones, the illegal tow, the work order, all of it, because Nancy thought she could make an example out of me. I pulled out my phone and opened the evidence folder. I had over 300 photos and videos documenting the entire ordeal. I backed them up one more time, just in case. Then I went inside and went to bed. The next morning, I woke up and went to work. Life went back to normal. The HOA sent out a newsletter announcing the new enforcement procedures and thanking residents for their patience during the transition. There was no mention of Nancy. A few weeks later, I got a letter in the mail from the tow yard in Jeffersonville. It was a final receipt showing a zero balance on my account. Attached was a note from the yard manager. It said, "Sorry for the trouble. We have updated our procedures to prevent this from happening again. If you need a tow in the future, call us and we will give you a discount." I put the receipt in the evidence folder and closed it. I did not plan to open it again. 6 months later, Nancy was released from jail. I never heard from her again. I found out from Linda that Nancy had moved to another state and was working in retail. She was no longer involved in property management or HOA enforcement. The HOA held an election and voted in a new board. Greg, the old board president, stepped down and a younger woman named Sarah took over. Sarah sent a letter to all residents outlining her vision for the community. She said the board would focus on transparency, fair enforcement, and resident engagement. She also said the board would conduct an annual audit of enforcement actions to ensure compliance with the covenant. I ran into Sarah at the mailbox one afternoon. She said, "I heard about what happened with Nancy. I am sorry you had to go through that." I said, "It is over now." She said, "I want you to know that the board is committed to making sure nothing like that happens again. If you ever have a concern, you can call me directly." I thanked her and went inside. A few weeks later, I got a package in the mail. It was from the HOA. Inside was a gift card to a local restaurant and a handwritten note from Sarah. The note said, "Thank you for your patience and for holding us accountable. We are a better community because of residents like you." I put the gift card in my wallet and threw the note away. I did not need the validation. I just wanted to live my life without someone threatening to tow my car every other day. A year after Nancy's arrest, I was still living in the preserve at Oak Grove. The new enforcement system was working well. Violations were rare and fair. The tow vendor had not been called once since the contract change. The neighborhood was quiet and peaceful. One evening, I was sitting on my porch when a neighbor walked by. He waved and said, "Hey, you are the guy who got Nancy fired, right?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Good." She gave me 3 violations in 2 weeks for nothing. I was about to move out. You saved this neighborhood. I did not know what to say, so I just nodded. He walked away, and I sat there thinking about everything that had happened. Nancy had tried to bury me in notices until I ran out of printer ink. She had tried to make an example out of me so everyone would learn. She had tried to use her power to intimidate and control. But she had made one critical mistake. She had lied about the board meeting minutes. She had said the board voted to tow me, but when I finally saw the official minutes from that night, they showed no vote, no discussion, and no mention of my address. Nancy had quoted minutes that did not exist, and when the board president checked the actual minutes, they contradicted her story completely. That single lie unraveled everything. It proved she had fabricated the authorization, and it gave the board the evidence they needed to fire her and terminate the tow vendor relationship. In the end, a tow vendor refused to act without proper authorization, and that refusal forced Nancy to escalate. Each escalation gave me more evidence. Each piece of evidence built the case. And when I finally showed the tow yard the time-stamped timeline packet that proved Nancy's story was mathematically impossible, they refused to keep cooperating with her. The yard manager had called the board president directly and asked if the authorization was legitimate. The president said no, and that was the moment Nancy lost. The final outcome was exactly what Robert Chen had predicted. The HOA settled and forced a full refund plus a written apology. Nancy's complaint was ruled unfounded, with evidence cited in the board resolution, and Nancy lost her committee powers permanently, along with her freedom for 6 months. I never framed the apology letter. I never told the story at parties. I just filed the evidence away and moved on. But every time I parked in my driveway, I thought about Nancy standing there with the tire clamp remote, clenching it like a trigger, convinced she had won. She had not. More HOA drama soon.